Now that we're done with voluntarism and structuralism, let us discuss about a couple of psychologists that have introduced and contributed some approaches that are still used or practiced today. Let's start off with Franz Brentano. Franz Clemens Brentano, born on January 16, 1838 in Marienburg, Germany, founded ACT psychology or intentionalism. Like Wundt, Brentano had many prominent relatives. Some of his aunts and uncles wrote in the German Romantic tradition, and his brother won a Nobel Prize for his work on intellectual history. When Brentano was 17, he began studying for the priesthood, but before being ordained, he obtained his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Tübingen in 1862. 2 years later, he was ordained a priest and in 1866 became a teacher at the University of Würzburg. Brentano eventually left the church because of his disagreement with the doctrine of Pope's infallibility. In 1874, he was appointed professor of philosophy at the University of Vienna, where he enjoyed his most productive years. In the same year, Brentano published his most influential work, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. In this writing, he tried to present a systematic psychology that would be a science of the soul. Like Wundt, Brentano believed that overemphasizing experimentation diverted the researcher's attention from the important issues. When Brentano was 17, he began studying for the priesthood, but before being ordained, he obtained his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Tübingen in 1862. 2 years later, he was ordained a priest and in 1866 became a teacher at the University of Würzburg. He agreed with Wundt that the search for mental elements implied a static view of the mind that was not supported by facts. He agreed with Wundt that the search for mental elements implied a static view of the mind that was not supported by facts. According to him, the important thing about the mind was not what was in it, but what it did. Brentano's views came to be called ACT psychology because of his belief that mental processes are aimed at performing some function. Concerned with mental processes or acts, he revived and modernized the scholastic philosophical theory of intentional existence. In psychical phenomena, he held there is a direction of the mind to an object. Example, one sees something. The object seen is said to exist within the act of seeing, or to have immanent objectivity. He suggested that fundamentally, the mind can refer to objects by perception and ideation, including sensing and imagining by judgment, including acts of acknowledgement, rejection and recall, and by loving or hating, which take into account desires, intentions, wishes, and feelings. These ideas, expressed in the psychology, formed the credo of his followers and became the starting point of their work. Each mental act refers to an object outside itself. Brentano used the term intentionality to describe the fact that every mental act incorporates something outside itself. Brentano used the term intentionality to describe the fact that every mental act incorporates something outside itself. Seeing is a mental act, which in this case has its object, the color. Brentano clearly distinguished between seeing the color red and the color red that is seen. Seeing is a mental act, which in this case has its object, the color red. Acts and contents are inseparable. Every mental act intends to an object or event that is the content of the act. To study mental acts and intentionality, Brentano had to use a form of introspection. He used the very type of phenomenological introspection. It is the analysis directed toward intact, meaningful experiences. For him, the mind is active, not passive. Brentano wrote very little, believing that oral communication was most effective, and his major influence on psychology has come through those he influenced personally. As we will see, there were many. One of Brentano's many students who later became famous was Sigmund Freud, who took his only non-medical courses from Brentano. Now let's move on with Karl Stumpf. He was born on April 21, 1848 in Weissenheide, Bavaria, now a part of Germany. He was a German philosopher and psychologist famous for his research on the psychology of music and sound. By the age of 7, Karl was playing the violin, and later he mastered 5 additional musical instruments and composed music. He enrolled at the University of Würzburg, where he was greatly influenced by Brentano. From the University of Würzburg, Stumpf went on to the University of Göttingen, where he earned his doctorate in 1868. He then returned to Würzburg and again attended Brentano's lectures. Deciding to become a priest, Stumpf entered the Catholic seminary at Würzburg in 1869. However, like Brentano, he couldn't accept the newly announced dogma of papal infallibility. There, he returned to Göttingen for postdoctoral study. In 1893, he accepted the chair of psychology at the University of Berlin. This appointment established psychology as an independent discipline within the university. At Berlin, Stumpf created a psychological laboratory. Stumpf was primarily interested in acoustical perception. He had published his influential 2-volume Psychology of Tone. Tone psychology was to investigate the phenomenon of tone sensation in order to understand the general psychic functions and processes underlying the perception of sound and music. He studied how different visual or auditory phenomena such as tones, colors, and images are interpreted in human mind. He believed that these phenomena can be either sensory or imaginary, sensory being as received by our senses and imaginary as interpreted by our mind. Like Brentano, Stumpf argued that mental events should be studied as meaningful units, just as they occur to the individual, and should not be broken down for further analysis. In other words, for Stumpf, the proper object of study for psychology was mental phenomena, not conscious elements. This stance led to the phenomenology that was to become the cornerstone of the later school of Gestalt psychology. Phenomenology is how an individual experiences phenomenon, the internal and external stimuli that they encounter every day. It is interesting to note that Stumpf played the prominent role in the famous case of Clever Hans, a horse owned and trained by Wilhelm von Osten of Berlin. To give you a brief understanding about this case, kindly watch this short video.
Hello everyone. Today I would like to talk to you about a seemingly smart horse with a suspicious intelligence. Wilhelm von Osten was a math teacher in Germany and owned a horse named Hans. In the late 19th century, Hans was trained by von Osten to do many intelligent tasks, including solving math problems, spelling out answers, identifying colors, and much more. This horse could do seemingly anything and would answer just by tapping his foot on the ground. Hans was an international marvel, and, fresh from Darwin's new theory of evolution at that time, society was captivated by the ability of animals. However, many were skeptical of Hans's abilities, and Germany's Board of Education created a group called the Hans Commission to investigate if there was trickery involved with Hans's skills. The commission consisted of a psychologist, a circus manager, many school teachers, a couple zoologists, and a horse trainer. They found absolutely no reason to believe that von Osten or Hans were tricking people into thinking Hans had abilities he did not have. This was their final conclusion, however they were still skeptical. But then a psychologist named Oscar Funks did his own investigation after the Hans Commission and set up numerous experiments to test the horse's abilities under different conditions. He tested having von Osten stand farther away from Hans when asking questions and found that accuracy dropped. He tested if Hans would answer a question correctly if von Osten knew the answer to the question and found that accuracy was good. He tested if Hans would answer a question correctly if von Osten didn't know the answer to the question and found that accuracy dropped to pretty much zero. What is going on here? What Funks noticed was that there wasn't necessarily trickery going on between Hans and von Osten, but unconscious cueing. For example, if von Osten asked Hans what 2 plus 2 is, Hans would begin to tap his foot. But instead of the horse knowing inherently what von Osten is asking, Hans would look at von Osten and stop tapping when von Osten unconsciously signaled that Hans was at the right answer. So if Hans reached the correct answer of 4, von Osten would tense up or look more intently at the horse when Hans was on his 4th tap, but not on purpose. This is obviously hard for Hans to pick up when von Osten doesn't know the answer or is standing far away, which is why accuracy dropped in those scenarios. In fact, this signaling is so subtle that even the Hans Commission could not see it. So why is this important? Well, this event defined what we in psychology call the clever Hans effect. The clever Hans effect is when a person or even animal picks up signals from the person testing them even if they are not doing it on purpose. This can lead to issues when testing. I mean, if I was doing a study where I told you to follow the ball in 3 cups and asked you to guess which cup the ball is in, and then proceeded to look at the cup the ball is in, the study is ruined. This is why it's sometimes important to have double-blind studies, where the researcher and the participant both do not know what is going to happen in the test, so that the researcher cannot unconsciously cue the participant one way or the other.
Next on the list is Edmund Husserl, who was born on April 8, 1859, studied with Brentano from 1884 to 1886, and then worked with Stumpf, to whom he dedicated his book Logical Investigations. Edmund was the principal founder of phenomenology. It is a method for the description and analysis of consciousness through which philosophy attempts to gain the character of a strict science. The method reflects an effort to resolve the opposition between empiricism, which stresses observation, and rationalism, which stresses reason and theory. Husserl accepted Brentano's concept of intentionality, according to which mental acts are functional in the sense that they are directed at something outside themselves. For Edmund, studying intentionality results in only one type of knowledge, that one person turned outward to the environment. Equally important is the knowledge gained through studying the person turned inward. For Edmund, there are at least 2 types of introspection. One that focuses on intentionality, and one that focuses on whatever processes a person experiences subjectively. For example, the former type would ask what external object the act of seeing intended, whereas the latter would concentrate on a description of the pure experience of seeing. Both types of introspection focus on phenomenological experience, but because the latter focuses on the essences of mental processes, Edmund referred to it as pure phenomenology. When the term phenomenon is used to describe a mental event, it refers to a whole, intact, meaningful experience, and not to fragments of conscious experience such as isolated sensations. He believed that it was premature to perform experiments on perception, memory, and feelings without first knowing the essence of these processes. Without such knowledge, the experimenter does not know how the very nature of what he or she is studying may bias what is found or how the experiences are initially organized. Husserl's goal: it is to create a taxonomy of the mind. He wanted to describe the mental essences by which humans experience themselves, other humans, and the world. He believed strongly that a description of such essences must precede any attempt to understand the interactions between humans and their environment, and any science of psychology. Indeed, he believed that such an understanding was basic to any science because all sciences ultimately depend on human mental attributes. Edmund also differed from his teacher Brentano and his colleague Stumpf by insisting on a pure phenomenology with little or no concern for determining the relationship between subjective experience and the physical world. Brentano, Stumpf, and Husserl all insisted that the proper subject matter for psychology was intact, meaningful, and psychological experiences. Next is Oswald Kulp. He was born on August 3, 1862 in Kandau, Kurland, Russian Empire. He was interested in many things, including music, history, philosophy, and psychology, but during the time, he was primarily interested in philosophy. He was majoring in history at the University of Leipzig when he attended Wundt's lectures and became interested in psychology. Under Wundt's supervision, Kulp received his doctorate in 1887, and he remained Wundt's assistant for the next 8 years. Kulp dedicated his book Outlines of Psychology to Wundt. He defined psychology as the facts of experience. In 1912, Kulp published on the modern psychology of thinking, primarily focusing on the importance of thought. Although starting out very much in the Wundtian camp, Kulp became one of the Wundt's most worthy opponents. Kulp disagreed with Wundt that all thought had to have a specific referent, that is, a sensation, image, or feeling. Kulp believed that some thoughts were imageless. Kulp first turned to the experimental study of higher psychic processes, thought and volition by the using of systematic introspection. He used systematic experimental introspection or controlled self-observation. This technique involved giving subjects problems to solve and then asking them to report on the mental operations they engaged in to solve them. In addition, subjects were asked to describe the types of thinking involved at different stages of problem solving. They were asked to report their mental experiences while waiting for the problem to be presented, during the actual problem, and after the problem had been solved. In this case, the main object of the study by this method was the procedural aspects of thinking rather than its result. The most important result of his research was the discovery of an independent mental reality, which cannot be reduced to the sensory content. Kulp's more elaborate introspective technique indicated that there were indeed imageless thoughts such as searching, doubting, confidence, and hesitation. The most influential work to come out of the Würzburg School was that on Einstellung, or mental set. It was found that focusing subjects on a particular problem created a determining tendency that persisted until the problem was solved. Mental set refers to an innate tendency to respond a certain way. Eventually, the mental set was seen as a factor that could account for a large portion of the variation in the ways that people solve problems. Mental sets could also result from a person's past experiences. Environmental stimuli do not automatically create sensations that become images. Rather, the process of attention determines which sensations will and will not be experienced. In addition to showing the importance of mental sets in problem solving, members of the Würzburg School showed that problems have motivational properties. Somehow, problems caused subjects to continue to apply relevant mental operations until solution was attained. The Würzburg School showed that the higher mental process could be studied experimentally and that certain mental processes occur independently of content. That is, they are imageless. Members of the Würzburg School made the important distinction between thoughts and thinking, between mental contents and mental acts. Therefore, Brentano and members of Würzburg School were both interested in how the mind worked instead of what static elements it contains. Now let's move on to Hans Wegener, born on September 25, 1852, in Germany. He established his influential book, The Philosophy of As If, a system of the theoretical, practical, and religious fictions of mankind. It proposed that man willingly accept falsehoods or fictions in order to live peacefully in an irrational world. He argued that all we ever experience directly are sensations and relationships among sensations. All we can be certain of are sensations. According to him, societal living requires that we give meaning to our sensations, and we do that by inventing terms, concepts, theories, and then acting as if they were true. That is, although we can never know if our fictions correspond to reality, we act as if they do. This tendency to invent meaning, according to Wegener, is part of human nature. He also saw life as a maze of frustrations and searched for a philosophy to make life livable. Fictions are not to be mistaken for true propositions, for fictions are known to be false. They contradict observed reality or are self-contradictory, and so they falsify experience. Something can work as if true, even though false and recognized as false. The philosophy of as if, in the face of an overwhelmingly complex world, we produce a simpler set of ideas, or idealizations, that help us negotiate it. Even in science, he wrote that we must proceed as if a material world exists independently of perceiving subjects. In behavior, we must act as if ethical certainty were possible. In religion, we must believe as if there was a God. The principle of fictionalism is as follows. An idea whose theoretical untruth or incorrectness, and therefore is falsity, is admitted, is not for that reason practically valueless or useless, for such an idea, in spite of its theoretical nullity, may have great practical importance. Everyday communication would be impossible without fictional words and phrases, according to Wegener. Science would be impossible without such fictions as matter and causality. Mathematics would be impossible without such fictions as zero, imaginary numbers. We encounter at the very threshold of these fictions one of the most important concepts ever formed by man, the idea of freedom. Human actions are regarded as free, and therefore as responsible and contrasted with the necessary course of natural events. There is a similarity between Wegener's fictionalism and the philosophy of pragmatism. Both fictionalism and pragmatism evaluate ideas in terms of their usefulness. However, Wegener believed that there was an important difference between his position and pragmatism. For the pragmatism, he said, truth and usefulness were inseparable. Wegener rejected this notion. For him, a concept could be demonstrably false and still be useful. The last person we'll be talking about is Hermann Ebbinghaus, born on January 24, 1850, in Germany. He wrote his dissertation on Hartmann's philosophy of the unconscious. In London, He bought and read a copy of Fechner's Elements of Psychophysics, which deeply impressed him. He later on dedicated his book Outline of Psychology to Fechner, whom he said, "I owe everything to you." Ebbinghaus' research culminated in a monograph titled On Memory, an investigation in experimental psychology, which marked a turning point of psychology. It was the first time that the processes of learning and memory had been studied as they occurred rather than after they had occurred. Ebbinghaus' research about learning and memory, most are still valid today and are being expanded by current researchers. Ebbinghaus' Principles of Psychology was widely used as an introductory psychology text, as was his Outline of Psychology. Ebbinghaus was the first to publish an article on the testing of school children's intelligence. He devised a sentence completion task for the purpose, and it later became part of the Binet-Simon scale of intelligence. To study learning as it occurred, Ebbinghaus needed material that had not been previously experienced. For this, he created a pool of 2,300 nonsense syllables, which was termed also as nonsense material. Ebbinghaus conducted a series of tests on himself, which included memorization and forgetting of meaningless three-letter words. From the pool of 2,300 syllables, Ebbinghaus chose a series to be learned. The series usually consisted of 12 syllables, although he varied the size of the group in order to study rate of learning as a function of the amount of material to be learned. Keeping the syllables in the same order and using himself as a subject, he looked at each syllable for a fraction for a second. After going through the list in this fashion, he paused for 15 seconds and went through the list again. He continued in this manner until he could recite each syllable without making a mistake, at which point mastery was said to have occurred. At various time intervals following mastery, Ebbinghaus relearned the group of syllables. He recorded the number of exposures it took to relearn the material and subtracted that from the number of exposures it took to initially learn the material. He called the difference between the two savings. By plotting savings as a function of time, Ebbinghaus created psychology's first retention curve. Ebbinghaus' forgetting curve describes the decreased inability of the brain to retain memory over time. The theory is that humans start losing the memory of learned knowledge over time, in a matter of days or weeks, unless the learned knowledge is consciously reviewed time and again. A related concept to the forgetting curve is strength of memory, which states that the time period up to which a person can recall any memory is based on the strength of the particular memory. Ebbinghaus also discovered another phenomenon called overlearning during his study on forgetting. The basic idea is that if you practice something more than what is usually required to memorize it, the effect of overlearning takes place. This means that the information is now stored much more strongly than thus the effects of forgetting curve for overlearned information is shallower. He also studied the effects of meaningfulness on learning and memory. He concluded that in learning lists of syllables, distributed practice is more efficient than massed practice. Being contented that because sensations are all that we can be certain of, all references to so-called physical reality must be fictional. So that ends my presentation about the early approaches to psychology. Thank you for listening.